What's up, guys? So I recently finished the last book in the Paxenarian series, which is Crown of Renewal, and I thought I'd do a video just talking a little bit about that series. I think most people have probably heard of the Paxenarian series through the original trilogy, which is Deed of Paxenarian, but I think probably fewer people have read the follow-up sub-series to that trilogy, which are Legacy of Gerd and The Paladin's Legacy. So in this video, I'm basically going to give a bit of a summary about what each of these series are about, without giving spoilers, and then what my thoughts are about each of the sub-series, and then just my ratings for each book as well. So I'll start off, of course, with the original trilogy that most people have probably heard of, and that's Deed of Paxenarian. So I'll just start off quickly with giving my ratings for each of the Deed of Paxenarian books. So the first one is Sheep Farmer's Daughter, and I gave that 4.25 out of 5 stars. The second book in that series is Divided Allegiance, and I gave that 4.5 out of 5 stars. And then the book after that is Oath of Gold, which I actually gave 5 out of 5 stars. So the Deed of Paxenarian starts off with the Sheep Farmer's Daughter, and I think, by the way, that this cover is pretty epic, and you can see it's actually a different edition than the other books that I have in this trilogy, the other two books, but I really love this cover. Anyways, so Pax is actually our single POV hero throughout this entire trilogy, which actually there are a few rare exceptions to that rule where we need to see her from an outside perspective, from somebody else's eyes, in order for certain things to get across, but that's pretty rare. So she starts off as an older teenager, and she's basically been told by her father that she must marry of course, the pig farmer's son. And Pax is not at all interested in this. She doesn't want to get married at all. I also, as a side note, wanted to say that I think it's pretty cool that Elizabeth Mood decided to make Pax very obviously asexual, or vocally asexual and aromantic. She does develop friendships throughout these books, but even in those moments where she is asked, why don't you want to have a relationship with so and so? Are you a lesbian? Or, asked whatever similar questions, she basically says, no, I have no interest in men, no interest in women. I don't really want to have, sexual or romantic relationships with anybody. I'm just not interested. She does also, it's interesting that you do kind of get to see her internal monologue a little bit on that too, because she does feel pressure to make those decisions, or she does feel pressure that, hey, maybe it would be better if I was in a relationship with this person, but it's mostly about her interest in preserving certain friendships more than her actual desire to be in any kind of relationship whatsoever. So yeah, I thought that was pretty interesting. Anyway, so Pax really wants to be a soldier like one of her older cousins. So at the beginning of the book, she sets out on her own and she goes to join the Duke's company. Now the Duke's company is a mercenary company that mostly hires itself out to fight in the southern region of this world called Aranis. Pax herself is from one of the northern kingdoms in this world called Tsaya, and she's from the borderlands of that kingdom. And then throughout this series, you kind of get to see different provinces or kingdoms throughout this world. Tsaya is one of the big ones. Aranis, as I mentioned, Fintha you'll see as well, and others that become revealed later on as the series goes on. As far as genre goes, The Deed of Paxenarian is military fantasy, and I would say heroic fantasy as well. And of the three books, I would say that The Sheep Farmer's Daughter is probably the book that is heaviest on military fantasy. The book focuses a lot on Pax's experiences during her recruit training, and a lot of the often what might be seen as more mundane aspects of soldiering, in addition to her first few years of fighting in the Duke's company. So if you're like me and you really enjoy military fantasy, especially for the training and logistical aspects, in addition to the actual combat and warfare descriptions, then I would definitely recommend checking out the Sheep Farmer's Daughter. And as I mentioned before, I would say in my opinion, Divided Allegiance and Oath of Gold only really get better after Sheep Farmer's Daughter. And after being very heavily military fantasy in that first book, the aspects, like there's certain aspects of the next two books that really feel like they're taking from sword and sorcery and heroic fantasy, especially Divided Allegiance, which has what I often call kind of a cool side questy, RPG side questy kind of feel to it. And the trilogy really winds up being most about Pax's own journey more than anything else. And just the way it's written, the Deed of Paxenarium is very much meant to tell the tale of the birth of a legendary hero. There are other wider world events happening, but a lot of these books are really just focused on Pax's own journey more than anything else. And it might sound a bit cliche, but I do think that the way Elizabeth Moon wrote these, and especially her writing style, doesn't really take the approach of a lot of modern fantasy. But I'll get to that, the writing style part, a little bit more in a minute. But I do think it's important to say, because it's really part of like the important themes of this book in the end. Elizabeth Moon herself is a veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps, and her husband is also a Vietnam War vet. And because of that, I found that she dealt extremely well with the psychological aspects of warfare, especially like PTSD, as well as the ethics of war itself. And early on in Divided Allegiance, there are some scenes that I found especially powerful. And it's hard to really talk about it without giving away spoilers, but I'm going to try to do that. So basically, it gives us the perspective of being a soldier who is seeing the fear and the horror that they are inducing in a native population, um, or the fear and the horror that that native population has for the army that that soldier is a part of, looking into somebody's eyes and then seeing how that person is seeing you. Um, being able to see through the eyes of a person who is looking at you, who is terrified of you, and the psychological impact of the realization when looking into that person's eyes. In a lot of fantasy, you do get those perspectives, but often it's accompanied with a sense of power, that the fear that other people have for you gives you power over them. But in this case, that's not it at all. It's the psychological impact of seeing yourself as the monster, as the evil, as the horror, and kind of recoiling from that, being both terrified yourself and disgusted by seeing yourself through somebody else's eyes. It's really hard to talk more about it without giving away spoilers, but I think those impacts on a soldier's psyche were really, really well done and really well written, without glorifying things. Again, it's hard to discuss the full impact that I felt from those early pages without really giving away spoilers, but it's one of the moments of the series that really stuck with me the most. But if I come back just for a minute on the writing style that I mentioned earlier, because I really, really do love it in this trilogy. So this is not really meant to be character-driven fantasy in the traditional sense that I think a lot of people think of character-driven fantasy. It is about Paxenarian herself and about her character's development, but the intent is here to tell us about her life and her path towards what is essentially near sainthood. The narrative for me really read like a medieval saga or a medieval saint's life, and I would not really be surprised if those were among Elizabeth Moon's influences, just considering other themes that she talks about, or that she includes in these books, whether that's looking at the way she looks at good and evil, the way she looks at traditional heroic narratives, and just, yeah, those kinds of themes throughout the series. Moon was also really heavily, or I thought obviously heavily influenced by medieval Christianity, and I didn't think it was done in the usual kind of cliche way that that often does get done. It fits very much with the way paladins are portrayed in the series, the way evil is portrayed in the series, and not only that, but the struggle to remain uncorrupted, or yeah, to struggle against corruption. But again, it's yeah, I I just don't think it was done. I think it was a unique take on that, in my opinion, anyway. So if you do want to read more about traditional Paladin characters, this is definitely a recommendation for you, since it does deal a lot with that. And I just want to go back to again, like I really did love the way that good and evil were portrayed in this series. Evil itself is in some respect portrayed as a kind of infection. And it's something that, it's about the way people deal with anger, frustration, resentment, and that kind of thing, and the way that it can be interpreted as manifestations or the spread of a toxin in the body in a way. And for me, part of that, the way it was done felt quite real. I mean, the supernatural aspects aside, I think just the way it dealt with the, dwelling on certain negative feelings like anger or resentment. Sometimes those things can be healing and cathartic, but other times, the more we allow those things to fester and the more we continue to focus on those things, they almost become self-replicating. It almost feels like it is actually like a poison that's taking over your mind and the way that you react to things, making you shorter tempered than you might otherwise have been had you not already been working yourself up or dwelling on something that perhaps wasn't healthy for you to dwell on. Um, I'm not sure exactly how to describe it better than that right now, but I did feel that it was quite real, or at least felt like it jived with some of my experiences. I really enjoyed the way that she portrayed that, and overall, I think the series in general just dealt very well with the psychological aspects of fighting certain things within yourself that you know aren't healthy, and also themes around redemption, resignation, and then the ways those come into this kind of struggle between good and evil that I would say is a little bit more nuanced than in many cases anyways. So the next sub-series in this wider Paxenarian series is the Legacy of Gerd. And this series, I would say, is probably the one that I've seen get the most mixed reviews. I personally enjoyed it, overall anyways. And my ratings, for example, for Surrender None was 4 out of 5 stars, and then my rating for Liar's Oath was 3.5 out of 5 stars. The two books are actually out of print. The original editions of this book are of these books, sorry, are out of print. So you're more likely to find this omnibus version, which is the Legacy of Gerd. As far as the books themselves, they take place hundreds of years before the Deed of Paxenarium, but even so, I would say that it's probably a good idea to read them after you've read the Deed of Paxenarium. These books are especially strong for the lore that they provide, the additional lore that kind of enriches the world of the Deed of Paxenarium. But again, I think it's good to read that first trilogy first before diving into this one. As far as Surrender None, that one is basically telling us the story of the life of Gerd. And Gerd is, if you've read the Deed of Paxenarium, he is one of the saints of that world. And the entire book is actually written from his perspective. And so we do get to see him as a regular human being, a very flawed human being, rather than the saint or a perfect divine being that the Gerdsmen tend to see him as in the Deed of Paxenarium trilogy. The other good thing about this book, and kind of understanding the concept of the behind the conditions that people were facing and what led to the peasants' revolt that led to the rise of the Fellowship of Gerd, is we get to kind of see how that organizational structure developed and the intent behind them, the terms that we see used by the Gerdsmen that might seem strange at first in the other Deed of Paxenarium books, or sorry, in the other Paxenarian books. And again, one of the reasons that I really enjoyed this one, as much as I did, was because of the narrative and the writing style that I talked about before. For me, it really did very much read like a medieval saint's life. It made me think, for example, of St. Augustine of Hippo's Confessions, which of course is his autobiographical work of his youth, which is probably the best thing I think that he wrote. But anyways, I found the style was definitely very different from a lot of post-2000s fantasy, and of course, even a lot of pre-2000s fantasy too. And I think maybe that style possibly doesn't jive well with a lot of modern fantasy readers for a lot of different reasons, but for me, it really did it for me. I really, really enjoyed it. But even so, I would recommend giving at least Sheep Farmer's Daughter a try. And then similarly, Liar's Oath, which is the second book in this subseries, is about another legendary figure who's connected to Gerd. So Luap kind of enters the story in Surrender None, and then he's also a very conflicted figure as we come to understand, and he's got a lot to work through. He's an annoying character to read, I thought, and there was definitely other perspectives in Liar's Oath that I enjoyed much more. But I think he was the way he needed to be. Again, that that annoying character that needs to be an annoying character. But yeah, so this actually, Liar's Oath is the first multi-POV, officially multi-POV book in the entire Paxenarian series. So we get Luap's perspective, but then we also get, I think, 3 or 4, maybe even 5 other perspectives that we see a fair bit. What I liked most about this book, though, was the way that it looked at the way that the lives of legendary heroes or saints are written, even in our world, or are portrayed to future generations, and why that is. How narratives can be altered, and again, what the reason behind altering those narratives are. There's a lot that deals with the way that Luap thinks that the story of Gerd, the story of Gerd's deeds, should be written for future generations to learn about, for people who never met him in life, hundreds of years in the future, as we see with the Deed of Paxenarian, for example. It deals with the question of, if or how certain narratives should be, or certain stories should be rewritten to fit traditional narratives that we have that are more likely to become popular legends, or perhaps that we just believe certain elements will make legends more popular, will draw more people in. And on where we think heroes come from, and also what the impacts are of embellishing stories or changing stories for future generations. What is the harm of doing that versus what are the benefits of doing that? So yeah, I thought those considerations, those exploring of those topics were very interesting and well done. And it's probably what I liked Liar's Oath most for in particular. I've also seen people say that you don't need to read these 2 books in order to read the next subseries, which is Paladin's Legacy. And Elizabeth Moon herself, I think at the beginning of some of these books, sort of gives a recap or not a recap, but yeah, I guess information or bits of lore so that people who haven't read it can kind of understand it. But I still disagree with the idea that you don't need to read Legacy of Gerd before reading Paladin's Legacy. I think you would definitely benefit from doing so. Even if these 2 books aren't her best books, I think they provide a wealth of lore, a wealth of information that are really, really important to the events that happen in the Paladin's Legacy, and also how we understand some of the figures in Paladin's Legacy. How we see Gerd and Luap centuries later, for example. So now we've gotten to the final, or at least final as of now, subseries of the wider Paxenarian series, and that is Paladin's Legacy. Here's the first book in that series, Oath of Fealty. So there was definitely a shift in the way that, or I should say a shift in Elizabeth Moon's writing style that came with this newer series. And I imagine the reason for that was the intent of the series is also different from the first 2 subseries. Paladin's Legacy is also a completely multi-POV epic fantasy, which is a pretty huge shift from what the previous 2 subseries were. They were neither of the other 2 were what I would call epic fantasy. As far as, because epic fantasy is often defined by scope, for example. So how, a Song of Ice and Fire type world where, you have far-reaching events that impact many nations or, many cities or people or that kind of thing. In this case, I would say this is the first subseries that I would really call epic. So we've mostly moved past that realm of telling stories of heroes and saints' lives, and now we're telling the stories of the fate of various kingdoms. And many of those perspectives are heavy on military fantasy, particularly the logistical aspects rather than the combat aspects. In fact, I would say the combat aspects take probably less time than they did in the first trilogy. It also brings a lot of change for many of the characters. Pax herself is not even a primary character in this book. She's not even a secondary character. She's more of a minor character who we do see pop up from time to time, and she does definitely have a role to play. But she's not a major perspective. I'm not sure that we even really see her as any kind of POV, more so as just a character who arrives on the scene kind of thing. But many of the main perspectives that we do get are actually secondary and minor characters from the Deed of Paxenarian. It'll basically help you understand who the main characters of this latest subseries are, since it includes previous characters like captains and sergeants from the Duke's Company, as well as other characters from the Deed of Paxenarian. It'll also give you necessary context around the events that are happening throughout Paladin's Legacy as well, that you wouldn't really have if you didn't read the Deed of Paxenarian, and to an extent you wouldn't have if you didn't read Legacy of Gerd either. So it's kind of hard to talk about these books, especially without giving spoilers for the first two subseries, but I will give you my overall ratings for them. So Oath of Fealty, I eventually gave 4.5 stars out of 5 stars. And then Kings of the North, I gave 4.25 stars out of 5 stars. The third book is Echoes of Betrayal, and I gave that 4.5 stars out of 5 stars. Limits of Power, I would say it was probably the weakest book, and I'm thinking of changing the rating from 4 stars to 3.75 out of 5 stars. Again, it was kind of the weakest book, I think, for me out of the 5, and it was mostly serving as more of a setup novel. And then the last book I rated 4 out of 5 stars, which was Crown of Renewal. So the first book, Oath of Fealty, kicks off soon after the events of Oath of Gold, which is the third book of the Deed of Paxenarian trilogy. One of the things I loved most about this series was the world building itself, whether it's the Deed of Paxenarian, Legacy of Gerd, or Paladin's Legacy. And at the end of the day, I would have loved actually an increased focus of that in Paladin's Legacy. I definitely read more books elaborating on the history of this world, different areas of this world that we never even encounter or we only see in passing, of the gods, the saints, and also the future of the world after, whatever happens. It's just so rich and so full of potential that I would just love to read more in this world. And one of the things that actually stuck out to me most, which I haven't encountered many books that really focused on this species as much as I would like, or at least now that I would like, are the gnomes and their society. As the books go on, we learn more and more about the gnomes, and I honestly could have read an entirely different book, or an entirely separate book, or even probably an entirely separate series specifically on the gnomes, and a particular gnome prince and his tribe, especially because those were very interesting. I will not go further into that. I also really liked how blood magic was portrayed, as well as the Innocen, I'm not sure how exactly to pronounce that, Quacknomi or Black Cloaks. They're names for the same species or subspecies portrayed in the early books. There was something really creepy about them too, and also the way that blood magic was portrayed. And I kind of wish Elizabeth Moon would have capitalized on that kind of building creepy atmosphere that blood magic and the Innocen originally had. But I found that actually in the first 3 books, I would say, was where that was, the first 3 books, sorry, of Paladin's Legacy was where that was strongest in my opinion. But as Paladin's Legacy went on, I found that atmosphere kind of disappeared a little bit over time, or it didn't really reach its potential, I guess you could say. But overall, the first three books in particular were very, very fast-paced. I often found them really hard to put down. The story was really gripping, especially the perspectives I especially liked and especially found like I could have just sped through were those that took place in Aranis, in Saya, and in Fintha. I would say that my least favorite perspectives were mostly those that took place in Leonia. And I just didn't find those stories in Leonia to be as compelling as the others, and I kind of wish that she had taken less time with them. I think there were certain plots that developed there, or subplots, I should say, that developed there that made us spend more time there that perhaps we could have spent elsewhere that would have been more interesting elsewhere. I don't know. I wasn't as big a fan of Leonia, but the others were, I thought they were all amazing. As I mentioned before too, Limits of Power is probably my least favorite book of the Paladin's Legacy series, mostly because I found that the perspectives really jumped around a lot and felt very erratic. I didn't feel like I could really attach myself to them ever. And it's not just that they shifted every chapter or something like that, because I have read other series that do that, and I was fine with it. But the way it was done here, I just felt that it was hard to really get a grip on, or hard to really um, attach myself to, really, and get allow my interest to build. But even so, there was definitely some really great moments in that book too, and definitely strong emotional moments towards the end of the book. And yeah, I really liked it for that and for a few other reasons as well, or certain perspectives as well. But overall, it was kind of like a setup book that I felt the perspective shifts were a lot jerkier than what I would have liked. And then the final book of the series was kind of a mixed bag for me. I would say that actually 50% or even like 75% of it was really great. I thought it was fast paced, like through again like the first 50%, very fast paced, full of intrigue, kind of like the earlier books were, and mostly focusing on perspectives that I liked the most, and so that's why I really liked the first half of this book, or even the majority of this book, really. But I think the problem for me was really the conclusion. The conclusion itself and the way that things tied together just kind of fell flat for me. Uh, it felt rushed, first of all, and I think, yeah, in that respect, the pacing, just thinking about the fourth book and then the end pacing in this one, or thinking back on like how some certain time was spent in Leonia again, for example, I think it could have been paced better so perhaps at the end wasn't as rushed. But at the same time, I also just didn't feel that the final conclusion intrigued me as much as the build-up to it did. So in that sense, I'm not sure I would say it was disappointing. I mean, it's disappointing in the sense that you always want a conclusion that really strikes like an emotional response in you, or like, excitement in you. But this one didn't really do that. And I wasn't really upset by it, to be honest. I still enjoyed the rest of the series a lot. It's not like I had any regrets about that. And I would definitely recommend it to fans of military fantasy and fans of fantasy that, you know, really do get a lot of interesting and intriguing lore. It's definitely heavy on the lore, and it just left me wanting even more of it. So there's a lot of amazing things about this series. I would absolutely recommend it in a heartbeat to anybody who, like I said, enjoys military fantasy, um, or even traditional like heroic fantasy, especially for the early books. But yeah, that is a little bit of a summary or look through wrap up of the Paxenarian series, which is in its entirety about 10 books long and makes up 3 subseries, as I talked about in here. So if you enjoyed the video, please don't forget to like and or subscribe, and I'll see you next time.